Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's office hours. I am Jennifer Splansky Jester, Executive Director of the Collective Impact Forum. Thank you for joining us, and we hope that this finds you and your loved ones, colleagues, and communities safe and in good health. This is our second weekly chat as part of the Managing Change in Rapidly Changing Times series, and we're glad to have you with us. I am calling in today from my home in Berkeley, California, so you'll see some children's artwork on the wall behind me, but I know you all are likely calling in from home as well. Well, when we kicked off last week, I shared that I was feeling a mix of overwhelm and fear and uncertainty, and also balancing that with gratitude for my health and safety and being connected sometimes virtually with loved ones. And I definitely continue to have a range of emotions and varying mental state, even daily or hourly, bouncing back and forth between work and childcare and family commitments. But I think this new normal is, in a strange way, sinking in. I assume that many of you are also balancing a lot right now, and thank you for carving the time out to spend it with us. So before we start, I want to take a moment to recognize the land that we are on. So let's go to the next slide. We'd like to acknowledge this virtual coffee is presented and recorded on the traditional land of the Ohlone people, the Potawatomi people, the Coast Salish people, and the Duwamish people, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Ohlone, Potawatomi, Coast Salish, and Duwamish people. Next slide. So in this weekly office hours, we are going to be spending about 60 minutes together. We'll spend the first share of that time. Paul will do a couple reflections from the conversations and thinking he's been doing. Then we're going to open up to questions, and we got some questions from you all ahead of time, and we'll also be taking questions in real time. We'll make a recording of this available after the webinar. That will be sent to the email where you registered. You also can actually download a copy of the slides as well as a handout that we'll be referencing today from the handout section in the webinar app. It's in the toolbar of the webinar app. Next slide. So if you have questions, you can use the question box. You also can email info@collectiveimpactforum.org if that is easier for you. Our colleague Tracy is running the back end of the webinar, and she'll be monitoring that for questions. Feel free, as always, to share on Twitter or your platform of preference. All right, let's go to the next slide. So this is something we actually did last week, and we're going to continue to do this weekly as we kick off our office hours. We want to share a tool that we on the Collective Impact Forum team used to do a temperature check or a status check with our teammates to see how folks are doing. And we're sharing this one so that you can see if you like this and use it with your teams. And then we're also, after I walk through this, going to do a poll and see how you all are doing today. This is a tool that my colleague Tracy created for us to use, and it really is a helpful way to just see where folks are and use our team time to calibrate and support each other accordingly. So let's see how everybody on the line is doing today. Tracy, I will ask you to launch the poll, and those of you on the line, if you're comfortable, let us know how you are feeling. So red, maybe a little bit overwhelmed or a lot overwhelmed.
Jen, did you drop off for a second there?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. So red.
All right, everyone.
Tracy, we can.
Everyone wants to take a couple minutes just to vote. Let us know how you're doing. All right, about 75% voted. Just a couple more seconds. Thanks to everyone for sharing. All right, I'm going to close it out and share the results. So it looks like, let's was that? Around 2% of people are feeling in the red category. They're feeling overwhelmed, immediate needs only. Around 19% are feeling orange, which is green on this, which is kind of funny, but orange for lots to manage, difficult to make course corrections. 51%, so over half of you, are feeling yellow, hanging in there, busy but not unmanageable. 19% are in the green category. We're doing pretty good, feeling positive and productive. And 9% were either blue or gray for feeling unfulfilled, unhappy, bored, or stuck. We really appreciate you all sharing that.
Great. Thank you, Tracy. Yes, it's a little funny that the poll was using different colors than than our scale. Terrific. So I suspect many folks in the world right now that are feeling red probably aren't making time to join us for their office hour, so maybe a little underrepresented of the sector at large, but we are glad to be here, with you today. All right, I am going to now hand it over to Paul to walk us through some reflections before we turn to Q&A. And for those of you who haven't crossed paths with Paul before, he is a senior advisor to the Collective Impact Forum and CEO of Leading Inside Out. He's an author, speaker, trainer, and consultant whose work focuses on leadership development, collaborative culture, racial equity, community engagement, and results-based strategies. So with that, I'm pleased to pass the baton over to Paul before we turn to Q&A conversation.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be back with you. For those who were with us last week, I'm going to repeat a few things, but also add some new things and some updated things. And I just want to also say that I wrote a blog this week that was kind of based on what I prepared last week for the office hours. That's available through the Collective Impact Forum blog that kind of shares a lot of this, and the slides are also available. I'm just going to start by saying kind of the important thing, which is this is crazy, and how wherever you are on that scale in terms of your work, I know a lot of people, and I certainly am, are feeling anxiety. We're feeling somewhat depressed. We're feeling all sorts of things. And I guess the first thing is just to recognize and acknowledge that's okay. Like, this is completely unprecedented, unpredictable, and it's upended a lot of our work. It's upended our lives. It's upended our families' lives, our friends' businesses. And so wherever you are in your feeling scale or emotional energy, like, is okay, and not to ever feel anything other than that is normal. It is normal to feel like things aren't okay. And our friend of the show, as I like to call him, Vule, who spoke at our conference a couple of years ago, wrote a great blog based on that, and just want to kind of acknowledge that. And what that calls us to think about is empathy. And we need to really lean into our empathy in our work, in our homes. I was joking before, but it's true. I've got multiple teenagers and college students at home right now. And I've learned that teenagers don't consider staying home with their parents every single day for a couple months to be a great thing. I call it bonus dad time. They call it grounding. But it's not necessarily something that everyone loves. We're all, in some ways getting on each other's nerves. At work, people are dealing with very different things in their lives and their families, people worried about others, people ill. And so just recognizing that we've got to lean in and remember that empathy is not about trying to fix others. It's about really being present in and acknowledging people's experience there, and especially the emotions underpinning it. Brene Brown, who also a friend of the show, she spoke at our conference 2 years ago, has these great kind of practices, and it's just good to remind ourselves of these practices and to kind of be present in them in our homes and our work as we check in with people, as we work with people, to really get into others' perspective, understand the context through which other people are seeing things. Well, I'm certainly have a lot of anxiety, I have a lot of privilege also, and being aware of how other people's experience may be different from yours at this time, especially when it has to do with issues like race and class and other things. Being non-judgmental and understanding that people are coming from very different contexts and are doing the best they can from where they are. Understanding people's feelings, be able to communicate that we understand those feelings. And again, being mindful. I think that in these virtual settings that a lot of us are meeting in, especially, really paying attention and listening actively and repeating what people are saying, and not doing other things when we're on the phone or on video, which is very tempting to do. And some of us, we can't help it because of childcare and other things, but trying to be as present as possible with each other and being mindful of that and is really important. The other thing is really that in adaptive leadership, there's this concept of getting off the dance floor onto the balcony, that when we're on the dance floor, we can only react to what's right in front of us. And so often in a crisis, we're just bombarded with stuff and we're trying to just keep up, and we're always on the dance floor. And the balcony is where we can go to gain perspective, to see patterns, to get a broader view of what's going on. And we need to create that balcony space in a crisis. And so it's important and for all leaders to be unapologetic about unplugging, about practicing self-care, about gaining perspective. If you can do that through exercise or meditation or talking to old friends or calling peer leaders and exchanging notes about how you're handling things, whatever those things are that will help you gain perspective and recharge, be unapologetic. Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's in charge of this whole crisis, is running every day. He's 79 years old and he's running like 3.5 miles a day. He's unplugging and doing that. We all should and we all can. In reflecting and talking to people over the last few weeks, I developed kind of 10 ideas for what collective impacts can do at this moment to kind of manage their way through this. And the first is to recognize you're going off plan, you're going off strategy, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment, and that's okay. Everyone understands. Right now, like, don't be worried that you're not going to get momentum or your performance measures. Right now is a massive disruption to everyone's work, and everyone understands that, and funders will hold you accountable based on that. Government, like, people have to understand that this is different and that we have to kind of create this space right now, and it's okay that you're going off plan. You'll come back. The second is to recognize that the beneficiaries or people that you serve, what needs do they have right now that you can help them with or make sure? It might be figuring out how to create activities for kids online. It might be there was an arts collective impact that organized to create an emergency fund for local artists. There were a bunch of behavioral health groups, collective impact efforts that came together to work on Medicaid waivers for telecounseling. Like, what is it your beneficiaries may need right now that you can mobilize resources and support to help them? The third is recognizing what vulnerabilities might the communities and people you serve have if they get the virus. And importantly in this, recognize that racial and other disparities that exist in our communities, and especially in health outcomes and economic outcomes, those are going to get magnified and exacerbated by a crisis like this. So making sure that our healthcare systems, our public leaders, our systems working on this are putting racial equity at the center of the work is something you can advocate for as well, to make sure our most vulnerable populations are being served and supported well, is to really put that in the center, but really pay attention to what you know that system leaders and other groups could utilize to make sure that you can help better prepare and support those populations. The fourth is to really think through, like, what if you get this? I mean, they've talked about massive scaling of this virus. What, how are you and your how do you have to prepare in case people on your team get the virus, or you do if you're out for a couple of weeks? What things can you put in place or agreements early on to make sure that you and your team can be supported if something like this happens? The fifth is to check in with partners who are overwhelmed by the demand for their services, like food pantries and some of the public health groups, or are facing financial crises as a result of this, and figure out how you can mobilize support for them. I know one collective impact I talked to yesterday that's doing a quick survey monkey to all their partners to kind of check in on how they're doing and what they need. And the backbone's doing this to just figure out kind of where are people at, and being aware of what people need, and figure out, like, how can those who might have some slack help those who don't, and how can we talk to funders and others about what organizations need. The sixth is to think about what local system leaders who are working on this crisis need, and collective impacts have skills in facilitation, recruiting and managing volunteers and partners across sectors, and collaborative action. You've got systems and tools for doing that. What assets do you have that you could deploy or make available to those leaders who are trying to work on this right now? Your tools and skills could be important to emergency response and management in your community, and deploying those could be very helpful. I learned last week about how the Jackson Community Foundation has helped that in Michigan, and ways they've used their collaborative muscles they've built through collective impact to support the response of the community. The seventh is for those of you who have funding relationships or are funders, how do you give groups more flexibility right now over the next 3 to 6 months to shift what they have to do and sustain their work by releasing restrictions, by giving more, by being more flexible, reducing reporting requirements? What can you do to help organizations sustain? Right now, it's about impact, and if we're thinking in that way, we have to recognize that having groups suffer or go out of business in the next few months is not going to generate more impact in the future. We've got to be flexible and let people sustain. And also, as you check in with your partners, making sure that funders are aware of what some of the needs of organizations or vulnerable communities are right now. The ninth is getting skilled at facilitating virtual meetings, and some of the basics. Always have meeting results. Someone needs to actively facilitate, using the chat space well. You can break people into small groups using Zoom, for example. You can have the big group and break into small groups. You can take meetings that were like usually much larger, make them smaller and do more of them to kind of create more generative time. There's a lot of things you can do to make meetings more effective at this time. And finally, again, just emphasizing that being empathetic and patient with your colleagues' pace and productivity. People are dealing with different things at different times. We're all experiencing different emotional journeys on this. Just being, again, patient and supportive of everyone as we work through this. And really, for those with leadership roles, managing change effectively, communicating clearly and consistently, not showing people the logic behind our decisions and where we're going and what we're doing, giving people responsibility within change. There's a lot that we can do to kind of help support people and be empathetic with them and be clear and transparent with them as we manage through this. So all of that is really important, and all this is expounded on in the blog that I wrote last week as well, but things that I've learned that collective impacts can think about. The other tool I've been really excited to see is one of my mentors, Marianne Urquia, who's a genius, who I've worked with a lot. She developed a strategy triage tool that I found enormously helpful, and as I've shared it with groups, they have too. And I want to kind of use this as kind of a way to answer a lot of the questions already asked, which is, what do you do? You've got a plan, you've got your work plan. What we've got to ask is really start with that line of sight. Where we, in the next 6 to 9 months, what do we need to do? And what's important right now? And then ask the question, what will it take to do that? And what might be important right now might not be what it was a month ago. It might not be exactly on your results, but get clear about what's your line of sight for the next 6 to 9 months based on the current conditions, and then ask yourself, what will it take to do that? Then look at your strategies and work plans and ask, what's still a current priority? What's still relevant? What do we continue forward, maybe with a modified approach, and how we modify that? But really be clear about what is it that still goes forward. What do we pause right now and resume when the crisis passes, assuming probably at least 6 to 9 months in that regard? But what are things that we would normally do that we just need to pause and then come back to? What are things that are newly prioritized, or things that were already in our pipeline that are moving to the front burner because the conditions make them a lot more relevant or important now? And what are those things? And then what are the things that we just don't know yet? We don't have enough data to know if we should shut it down, if we should pause it, but we've got some answers to get some data to gather before we make that decision. And finally, what are we going to honor but let go and recognize that these things just aren't on the table right now and are things we're going to have to maybe consider in the future, but right now, considering the circumstances, aren't important. In the resource box on this webinar, there are also handouts that Marianne created and were in her blog for the Center for Community Investment, and some PDFs, including a blank version of this, and instructions and the tool, and also an example, which I think is helpful, that shows you kind of like what would it look like to fill these things in. And again, I just think this might be a really helpful tool for people to look at who are considering how you triage and adjust your strategy right now. And again, just know it's okay you're doing that, and everyone will understand. And right now, you've got to figure out what's the best way to manage and support your community and support your partners over the course of this period. And know you will get back to the impact and work and plan that you have, but your timelines and things are just going to be adjusted, and that's okay. I'm going to turn it back to Jennifer then to guide us in the Q&A. And we got a lot of questions from you all already. And we also have, I'm sure, some coming through the questions and chats today. So thank you, everyone. And thanks again for everyone for showing up today.
Terrific. Thank you, Paul. So we've had a couple of folks asking, where can you get copies of the handouts? So you can download them from the handouts tab in the webinar app. You also will get a link to them in the post-event, post-webinar email that we send out. And Paul, what was the website that people can go to for Marianne directly?
Yeah, it's the blog is on the Center for Community Investment. And you could also just, like, once you get the handouts, you could easily just Google strategy triage Marianne or something and find it. But it's the Center for Community Investment, and her blog is up there, and great.
Great. All right. So, Paul, you've begun to allude to this, and Marianne's tool certainly is a helpful tool to use. But I think in addition to kind of the big picture strategy questions of what to prioritize, I think a lot of folks are curious about how to move planning processes forward and how to recognize like the immediate needs, but balancing that with some of the longer term vision that a lot of collective impact initiatives have set.
Yeah, and I'm dealing with that with a couple of clients right now, and I think that there's a few thoughts. One is your perfect, highly, deeply community engaged process is going to get adapted somewhat and not be as ideal as you'd like. But the important thing is we are going to come out of this, and you do want to have something to build momentum on that will make a difference in people's lives when we emerge from this. And so being aware, and I think one thing is making sure that the people who are participating in your planning process, that this is something they still have time and bandwidth for. And so I think checking in with your key partners to make sure that they're still they still see this as relevant and worthy of their time at during this period. Then I think that thinking about how do we adjust the way we gather information and gather people, again, using tools like online meetings and things, and recognizing that for some, you can do a very large meeting like this where we have 300 some people on it. But if I'm trying to brainstorm, it's like when I'm at a table, it's 8 or 10 people is going to work better. And maybe doing 3 meetings with 8 to 10 people versus 1 with 30 people if I'm trying to brainstorm and generate, because they'll give me more time for everyone to weigh in, and I can call on people and really engage them. And so I think checking in on people, slowing it down a little bit, finding ways to engage, talking to partners in different parts of the country. What I'm hearing is that the reality is most people have phones, and so a lot of the technology, whether it's Google Hangout or Zoom or things, most people can access. If someone can create a TikTok video or post something on Facebook, they can probably get onto these conferences. Not everybody, but recognize that phone technology is probably going to work better than computer technology, and thinking and designing a little bit more for that, and even the apps that allow people to engage in that way. Thinking about how to, and again, I would reach out to folks and just try some things on and try some things out. But my thought is basically like, until we can start gathering people again, think about how you slow things down a bit, check in with partners, move things virtual, and do things virtually in ways that can generate the most engagement.
Yeah. And what about working around the constraint that some people don't have time or bandwidth to participate in, or they're telling you they don't have time or bandwidth to participate in the collective impact work right now?
That's okay. I mean, like, we're all, as I said, we've got to be okay and empathetic with that. And the question is then, we can ask them, are they comfortable? Like, if we wanted to start moving forward on this, how can we honor them and honor their time? So could we like do a 20-minute check-in every other week with just what's happening to make sure their voice can get captured? Are there things we could send them, like, or are they comfortable with letting go or could delegate to someone, but find out? Or do we have enough people who don't have bandwidth that we say, listen, we're just going to hold for 2 months and then we start again? So I think it's just checking in with people and checking in with, like, um, uh, if we have like a lot of people who can't participate actively, that means we need to pause.
Hmm.
If we have a lot who can and some who can't, then let's check in with those who can't and figure out, like, how do we engage them? How can we make it as simple as possible for them to engage so that they would feel comfortable and confident in moving the process forward?
Hmm.
So I think it's just best to check in.
And I'm also, Paul, thinking about some of the things you already reflected on, that there might be ways that the collective impact initiative itself adjusts so that the work is related to what's happening in the
Right.
moment, and it may engage them in their mission critical work as
Yeah.
part of the work the collective's doing, as opposed to it feeling unrelated to what
Right.
people are dealing with in the moment. And
Yeah.
that might not be in the next few weeks, but maybe in, hopefully, the few months.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, we've gotten some questions around, obviously, a lot of nonprofits and other organizations are facing, small businesses are facing real financial challenges right now. And folks were wondering if we have any advice around making a fundraising ask in these times without seeming too desperate. And I know you're not a fundraising consultant, nor am I.
Yeah. Um,
We wish we were, but yeah.
yeah. I think it's okay to be a little bit desperate. Um, and the economy, I mean, we had 6.6 million unemployment filings, 10 million in 2 weeks. The highest before was in 1982 at 600,000. We're like stratospheric. I mean, it's just, it's crazy, right? And so I think that right now people have to get out of their mental models around, like, trying to control what groups do, and like, and just realize that sustaining the sector and the work is a good in and of itself and critical right now. And that if we care about community, we need groups to be able, like, there are going to be a time when people can go back outside and they're going to need community centers and they're going to need community groups and they're going to need public health and they're going to need youth development. And we even though a lot of those things might be paused right now, and especially those fee producing ones are not getting fees right now, we need to cover that. And so I think that it's okay, and we should be honest and realistic and create space. And if we actually have funding, but we don't have the ability to do as much work, how can we help those who those organizations that might need more support? So I think that be honest and direct with the funders that you have and let them know what your 6 to 9 months looks like, and be clear about what you're going to do to manage that. The other thing is everyone should be really clear about the CARE Act, and everyone should be um, uh, independent sector has great resources on this, independentsector.org. They've had webinars on this. They've got a breakdown. The Chronicle of Philanthropy has done well on this. And the reality is your banks are going to get bombarded by small businesses fast, and you qualify for these same things and they'll be forgiven. You can get loans to keep your employees on. You can get loans to cover costs of new forms of engagement and tools that you need because of the coronavirus. So nonprofit organizations should also leverage the policy tools and funding available because it's available both to small businesses and nonprofits. You also, non-itemizers who are employed can give and itemize the donations. So I think just utilizing the tools that are in the bill and going to places like independent sector and the Chronicle Philanthropy to make sure that you're aware of that, talking to your banker, whoever banks your organization, about kind of what opportunities they have for you. And then on top of that, being very direct and clear with donors, and not being afraid, and but saying, listen, this is what our next 6 to 9 months looks like, and this is these are the gaps that we're going to have and need help on, and just be real about it. And then banding with your fellow organizations to also educate and advocate donors who might still be stuck in a mental model about restricted grants and programs, and need to move to a space of like, we need a sector that can survive and thrive beyond this period of crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Let's see. So, Paul, I'm just going to ask this one because I love how the person wrote it in the Q&A box. You know those climate change deniers? What about those denying that this will take many months to work out, who thinks this will all be over in 2 months?
Yeah.
Do you have any advice on navigating those conversations?
Um,
I had to ask it like it was written. It was too good.
yeah, I mean, boy, it's hard, right? And so, in the blog, and last week I talked about the Stockdale paradox, and in the book Good to Great by Jim Collins, he talks about how Admiral James Stockdale talked about surviving as a POW during the Vietnam War and being tortured constantly. And he talked about the people who didn't survive were the people who thought, next month I'm going to get out, next month I'm going to get out, and it never came. It came too late, and they died of broken hearts. And he said those who survived were those who had absolute, confronted the brutal facts directly, and were completely honest and direct and absorbing of what the brutal facts on the ground were, but also at the same time held ultimate faith they would prevail, but not false hopes that kept repeating themselves. And I think in the same way right now, we've got to deal with really deal with the data and the brutal facts on the ground, while also knowing we are going to move through this. We are going to get to the other side of this. There will be a vaccine. There will be a time when we can test and trace and limit who has to quarantine versus the whole society having to distance. And so I think that data to me has been helpful, and I even in my communities, because it helps me, I've got my own spreadsheet and I'm tracking the growth and watching that like our growth has actually slowed down, and watching both the growth in casualties as well as in the virus, but just as a way of just like being real about like, okay, like this is, we know that for a few months we've got to do these extreme measures. I wish our leaders were better at explaining what comes next in terms of the test and trace period, and they're not doing a good enough job on that. But I think for those who are denying, we've just got to be really clear that like we have to do what we're doing now to create that space, and we don't know what it's going to be in 2 or 3 months. Like if you just think like this is going to end and it's all going to go back to normal, it's going to go back to something different, and we don't know what that completely is yet. And so we've got to really just allow ourselves to be a day at a time, in a way, a month. Like things change constantly, but we don't fully know yet what that next phase looks like. We have some idea of it, but we can't just Pollyannishly like hope that like in 2 months this is all going to end. Again, if they keep saying 12 to 18 months, what I'm hearing groups say is we've got to really just think in the next 6 to 9 months, recognize that things will be completely different, and we don't know much beyond that. But we know if we're thinking in 2 months this is all going to be normal, it's not. So we've got to confront that reality, but also know we'll move through it, and know that there will be a next phase that will be different than this phase, but we don't know exactly what it's going to be like yet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Back to engaging folks at this time. Someone says, is it fair to expect families to engage with the same intensity? How about all the multiple demands on families' times? If I'm a parent, work, child schooling, stress, what about families facing even extreme situations and loss of income? It's not.
Yes. Check in, like again, like practice that empathy and lean into it, and ask people, because there are also people who need the diversion. Like there are people who are reading way too much of the news, and there's people who are, I mean, people are in such different places. So I think that the main thing is like check in with people and ask. And um, you might be surprised because some people are like, yeah, I need something to keep my mind off of this and do right now. And others are like, I've got no bandwidth for anything right now. And some are in just, people are in just very different states. I had a call the other day with people from different coalitions, and there's people whose family or personal situations are very fraught for them. And there's others who are like, want to get going. And so it's just check in with people and realize that you're going to have to differentiate how you work with people based on where they are. And again, people are in different places, and that's okay.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'm going to shift to some questions around like people management. So, tips on making staff feel included and ensure they know what's going on. Do you have any reflections there?
You know, that I would say go back to the basics of change management, and I've got those in my blog as well. They come out of primarily the work on adaptive leadership by and in books like The Practice of Adaptive Leadership and Leadership on the Line and others. But the basic concepts are, first, be aware that people have different anxiety and stress levels with change and the changes going on now and what's happening in their lives. Communicate clearly, consistently, transparently, let people know what's going on, and make sure that people don't feel like there's things happening they don't know about. The third is, as you make decisions, show them the math. Just like in school when you had to kind of like not just write the answer to the division, you had to show how you got there. Walk people through your logic. Let people know what you're observing, how you've interpreted, what assumptions you've made, what's the logic by which you've come to that decision, so that they can understand why you're doing what you're doing. Then, figure out within the change you're making, how can people participate? What responsibility can you give people within the changes and things that you're making? So I think just those basic change management principles are really important, and the more transparent and direct you can be, and again, in that Stockdale paradox way, letting people know how your plan and confidence and faith that you will move through this, but the brutal facts that are about that distance between now and that line of sight you're holding, and what that's going to mean, and how you're thinking through that, and invite people to give feedback and input into some of those decisions and how they can help implement them.
Great, great. And sort of in the same realm, do you have any advice for managers or leaders who are working to do team building and building a team in a sense of camaraderie right now, particularly if there isn't a great base to build from when you transition to a virtual setting?
Yeah.
Kind of starting from scratch.
Yeah. I think always creating space in meetings for checking in. And what I've been doing on calls is asking people, like, what are they doing to center themselves and to take care of themselves right now? Maybe doing icebreakers still, just because, again, like we need a little bit of laughter, and like fun icebreakers can be good in terms of just like we're all dealing with heavy shit, and it's nice to kind of have that space. But always creating space for people to check in on how they're doing, and to acknowledge, and for everyone to empathize and recognize and understand where people are coming from, so that as we're doing the work, we know kind of what people are carrying, because everyone's carrying things in addition to the work we're trying to do. And then again, I think if we've got a very large group, breaking it down, because a call with 30, 40 people, I did one yesterday where we had that size, and it was okay, it was planned to be that, but like, the check-ins took 45 minutes of a 90-minute call, and that was okay. And it actually was really important, and there are people who shared things that needed support. And so like a large community, but if you're trying to actually get a lot of generative work done, then maybe it's like, let's break it into a few meetings and like, again, do it that way. So I think that to build community, I think the first part of building community is building connection, and building connection starts with just allowing people to be exactly who and where they are right now, and accommodating for other people's needs, and recognize that if someone can't make it because they're dealing with something, sharing those notes back to them right away and checking in with them afterward, and again, just not trying to not make people feel guilty right now.
Yeah. Paul, you do a great icebreaker. I've seen you do it a number of times where you ask people about like what makes them a great friend or family member. You want to share a couple of those prompts with people?
Well, sure. I mean, one of the activities I often do with groups is we do these interviews in pairs where you ask someone but you could actually have people introduce themselves, but what are 2 or 3 things that make you a great family member or friend? What are 2 or 3 things that make you great at your work? What are 2 or 3 things you love to do so much you can get lost in for hours? We use ones like when we have to use them fast, like what's the first concert you ever went to, or what was your first job ever, like when you're growing up, like things that just give people insight into you and help people connect to you, and again humanize the work, and let us know each other. Building community, again, is building that sense of connection. And then again, where you notice that somebody's struggling or whatever, how do you check in with them after? How does the community check in with them after? If someone's missing it, how do you follow up with notes and things? So I think thinking of those ways that you can kind of, again, build connection.
Yeah. Yeah. One that I've done with teams that people really enjoy is, what is the origin of your name? And you get some really interesting um, insight into folks. And then, some lighter ones like, what's your favorite breakfast cereal? You can make them super silly or quite deep, and depending
Yeah,
on your team and the vibe, some uh,
just
some
create the
deep
space, but especially
commentary.
create, yeah.
Exactly.
I
Yeah.
think mixing the fun with the deep is good, just to kind of, again, balance people's emotion and give people
Yep.
kind of the ability to laugh a little bit while we also struggle.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So feel free to keep sending questions in the chat box. I'm going to take a couple more. So, what are your thoughts about people or groups being left behind? It appears that people are trying to outdo each other and not wanting to be left behind. Goes a little bit against the idea of slowing down.
I'm not sure I understand that fully. So people are trying to outdo each other and being left behind?
Yeah, I'm taking this out of the chat box. So, if the person that put that in wants to elaborate,
Yeah, I'm
feel
not sure
free to
I
do
understand
so.
that.
Yeah. Um, cool. So let's see. I'm going
I
to
want to come
respond
back
to,
to that, but I need to know a little bit more about that.
yeah, sure. Someone put in a question comment here. So I want to say that about the check-in at the beginning, the color
Yeah.
check-in focuses only on productivity and doesn't
Yeah.
take anxiety into account, which is so present right now. I think that's a great point, and I think
Yeah.
that I will just reflect that when our team uses that tool, we actually do incorporate our
Mm.
whatever our state, our mental state is based on not only our work but the broader world into how we answer that question. So I think you're right.
Yeah.
It's impossible to separate work,
Yeah.
your work state and your life state. Everything is feeling very and should be very
I
interconnected
noticed
right now.
I
I
noticed
think that's
that
a
last
great
week.
point.
I noticed that
Yeah.
last week. I chose blue gray, not because I'm not feeling productive or like it was more just because I'm anxious and a little bit depressed, and that wasn't like in there.
Yeah.
So I just picked like the blue gray because I'm like, that's kind of my sky is a gray blue right now. It's in in how I'm kind of dealing with this. And so but I think great advice, and we should think about kind of adapting that a little bit more, because I think people are dealing more with their personal emotion than their kind of work
Yeah.
productivity. Yeah.
Definitely the intent of creating the
Yeah,
space to have that
absolutely. Yeah,
conversation. Yeah, for sure.
thanks for that. Did the person elaborate at all on the that comment or question before?
Not yet. So we
Okay.
will just keep going.
Because I'm not
Um,
sure what it means by being left. I mean, I do think that people are trying to outdo themselves in being the most coronavirus-free home, and it's like someone had this great thing yesterday about like that they had to, that they were going into the black hole of using Clorox wipes to wipe off the new box of the Clorox wipes. Um, to then watch. It's just I think and it's all so important. Um, and we've got to be doing that. But I do think there's a little bit of a woke Olympics happening with it too, that's happening in more privileged communities, and is ignoring the fact that other communities don't have the ability to work at home, don't have the ability to ship their products on Amazon as easily, don't have credit cards, or don't have the ability to get the same food resources others do. Like And that's where that empathy of not allowing our power and privilege to like dominate our perspective on how people are doing this, and also to recognize that those racial and other disparities that exist in our communities get exacerbated by times like now, to just recognize and be aware of that some of what we're asking people to do is easier to do when you have more privilege. And so just being aware of that, and then thinking again of how we support and recognize and create pathways for people who don't have the same access and abilities. I have a home office already. I already work from home. My wife has the ability to work from home. We have technology for our kids to do their schoolwork. We were able to, shop and get things before this all started because we were reading the news a lot, and we were kind of following it more than, not everyone reads the news all the time or follows it. So like just being aware that some of our more vulnerable populations like are entering this in different space. And that's why we're seeing spikes in my city of Milwaukee, especially. We're seeing the spikes in lower income communities versus in the more affluent communities. And so we've got to be aware of these issues and of equity issues within this, like everything. And again, making sure our systems, making sure the way we're talking about it is cognizant of that.
Yeah, I think there's some theories coming in also that are good to comment on. So the outdoing each other, I think, in two ways can be interpreted. One is there are now 1 million intermediaries and nonprofits trying to send out information on how to deal with COVID
Right.
and perhaps, be the go-to resource. And so that is one way that might be presenting itself. Another is within teams. If people are fearing layoffs or are fearing that their role might be less relevant, they're trying to demonstrate their value, and some folks are not overworking, but really trying to make the case of the value that they're bringing to their organization. And so I think those are both true,
I mean, it's a huge and real anxiety. I worked with an organization last week that laid off hundreds of people. It was horrible. And it's real. And we know, as I said, 10 million unemployment claims in 2 weeks. So we know a lot of organizations and groups are fearing and facing this, and whether someone is, maybe their spouse or partner or roommate or friends are. Definitely being aware of that. And again, I was speaking more in terms of people kind of publicizing how they're trying to be like the experts. We have a lot of new public health experts all over the country. But I think that just, and I certainly hope I'm not a public health expert anyway, but I'm just like, I'm reading all this stuff too. And it's like, we can get kind of stuck in that loop, and just, again, open ourselves up to others' perspectives and be aware of like, how can we support and educate and help others who it might be harder for to do the things that are a little easier for us to do. I'm also an introvert, so like being stuck up here, I'm not, is okay for me. For other people, I know some extroverts who are like, who live alone even, who are really struggling, and that's real.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of that and reaching out to those people and creating space.
Yeah. And to folks, the other interpretation around sort of the overwhelming number of resources now available on COVID. I mean, there's not a single site that I personally would endorse. I think, the sites that you trusted as good sources for you and your organization before, I would say continue to look to them if they're providing resources. I think, Paul, you did mention independent sector as a good kind of sector-wide nonprofit resource for things on policy and that type of space.
In the blog, we mentioned the Ford Foundation's effort and the sign-on by foundations and others on how foundations can better support nonprofits at this time. Today, independent sector, the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy, the Center for Effective Philanthropy, Hispanics in Philanthropy, a bunch of other groups came together and issued a public letter that's also on the Chronicle. I just put it on my LinkedIn post and on Twitter, but that's calling on foundations to dip in their endowments, that the perpetuity of the sector right now is more important than the perpetuity of their named foundation in 100 years, and calling on foundations to really think about how they use their assets right now. There's independent sector great resources on the new federal legislation and how it can impact your organization. So again, being aware of that. Policy Link, if you're thinking about equity and racial equity, they just issued yesterday principles for a common sense street smart recovery that talks about kind of equity in the center of how we think about recovering from this. You know, the forum, we're trying to do our best to aggregate resources. I shared Marianne's resource. So I think we, as an intermediary in a way, I mean, part of my job right now is I'm trying to find what's out there and figure out what I can share back with the folks who are calling in and the people that we're communicating to. And so some of those resources that you normally use and are kind of have expertise in different spaces are the ones I'd be going to.
Yeah, yeah. You mentioned a little bit on change management before, Paul, and change management in times of crises. Are there resources that you would point people to who want to go a bit deeper? I will say that one thing I've seen is, I'm drawing a blank on the name of Brene Brown's nonprofit, is
Yeah.
putting out some tools about leading in times of crisis and
Yeah.
change that I think are, for those that know her work, very grounded in empathy and vulnerability and very research-based, but also very applied. So I think her work is quite
Yeah.
excellent. Are
Yeah,
there
and I
others you
think
would point
her
to?
website has those resources, and I think her LinkedIn and like I think she's posting those, so they're easy to find. I mean, like I learned a lot about change management from the kind of adaptive leadership stuff. And the best book on that is The Practice of Adaptive Leadership by Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky and Alexander Grashow. I use it a lot in my training, use a lot in my work, and it's a place I always go back to. But they have a lot on change management and kind of adaptive leadership. And if this is anything right now, it's like massive superhero adaptive leadership stuff right now. It's like can't think of a time that's more adaptive. So I think that could be a great resource if I was going to pick up a book and kind of like look for ideas and principles right now. That's where I'd look, and that's one of the resources I pulled on when I started thinking about all of this. They're the ones who talk about getting off the dance floor onto the balcony and the change management and a lot of these other things that I think are helpful. And so I think some of that stuff could be enormously helpful.
Great, great. So I think we'll make this actually the final question. You mentioned a little bit earlier about self-care, but could you say a little bit more about approaching self-care during this time, Paul?
Yeah, I think that a lot of us who do this work are servant leaders. And certainly, I would put myself in that camp at some level in the fact that I cook all my family's meals. I'm very hands-on with my kids. I'm like in my work with my clients doing a lot, and there's this desire to be of help to others. And when we get on a plane, they always say, put on your oxygen mask before you put on others. My ability, all of our ability to be of service, to be of help is going to be limited if we're ourselves not taking care. And I think often some of us feel guilty when there's so much need out there that needs to be served about taking time for ourselves. But this is not a sprint. This is going to last a while. And doing the things that you can that sustain you, that create space for you, that give you comfort, that give you the ability to kind of step back and think, all of those things are really important. And just to recharge. None of us are working on a normal schedule right now. And if you in the middle of the morning want to go play with your kid for an hour, go do it. Because you'll be way more productive in the afternoon having done that than not. And so just recognize that sometimes that taking steps back allows us to get more done when we step back in. And that when we're dealing with all this crisis stuff, figure out a way to step back. I often, when I was in my CEO role, I had an executive coach, but I also had, I had my board members who I could have more like generative conversations with where they wouldn't judge. But I also had like a handful of peer leaders I would constantly compare notes with and just ask, like, share, like, how would you handle this? Like, what are you seeing? Like, figure out where it is that you can gain perspective and maybe see things in a different way. And what you need to do to kind of create space for yourself. It might be journaling at the beginning every day, or meditating, or getting in some exercise. As I said, if Dr. Fauci can do it, you can do it. But I think, and being unapologetic, even if you're working on really important needs, about creating space to like turn off your phone and not use it for an hour and be with your family and be present and just like rest your mind. Because if you're always in it, you're not going to sustain. And the communities you serve, the people you serve long term will not be helped if you burn out in this process. And we're all carrying a lot. And again, it's okay to not be at the top of your game right now, but do your best and create space for yourself. It's okay.
Great, Paul, thank you. I think that's
Thank you.
a great point to end on for today. So I'll just share a couple closing sources to follow up and have additional information. But before I do that, I want to thank you, Paul. Always good hearing from
Thank
you and
you all.
chatting with you and brainstorming. We do have these office hours every Thursday for the next few weeks, and Paul will be joining us, and we'll be bringing in a couple other colleagues as well.
Thank God.
So
I look forward to sharing the
it's
mic.
always fun talking with you, Paul. But yes, we welcome everyone to join again as well. If you could flip to the next slide, Paul, just a couple of things we wanted folks to know about. So if you want to go immerse yourself quite deeply for a few days in these types of conversations, the Collective Impact Forum is hosting our virtual convening in May. This was originally scheduled to be our annual in-person convening of about 900 folks in Minneapolis, but we're adapting to be virtual, meaning we can open it up, lower the price point and then open it up to the field. So welcome folks to join and would love to have you. And then if you want to do some podcasting on these kinds of topics and conversations, we actually launched a podcast. Thank you to our colleague Tracy for her work on that. And if you go to the next slide, Paul, you can get the podcast on any of your favorite podcast platforms. And we have a mix of kind of practical how-to sessions that my colleague Robert Albright and I have recorded. And we also have the audio from keynotes from many of our past events. Voulet, you already mentioned here, and today, Paul, and we have a number of others. And we'll be posting podcasts all the time, so we invite you to check them out at your convenience. So with that, I will just say thank you. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Tracy, who is hiding behind the scenes. And thanks to everyone who was able to join us today. And we wish you all the best.
Thank you, everyone. Hang in there, everyone.
Good health.
Be well. Take care.